The story began with a beautiful sunrise over a big city. However, one guy had been on his feet for a long time, working tirelessly. His day always started way too early. He was very meticulous about cleaning his place because, in his opinion, cleanliness was crucial. Soon, the entire room was supposed to be spotless, with only the last few inches of dirt remaining. A slight smile appeared on his face as he realized he had finished, and everything was finally clean. But he continued to sit on the floor, enjoying the order he had created with his own hands. He looked around the room one more time and praised himself for the cleanliness of his home. Besides, he had mopped the floor 3 times and checked everything, so it was time to wrap it up. Still, he really decided to finish cleaning and started gathering his rags from the floor. After that, he tossed them into the sink and decided to do some laundry. Admiring himself, he hummed and even danced a little. However, the man kept staring at something behind him that he saw in the mirror. In the bathroom filled with blood lay the bodies of dead people. They were tied up, their mouths taped shut, and at that moment the man was getting ready to wash them. There was no time to waste, so he immediately began his dirty work. Meanwhile, 11 hours had passed, and the police, along with forensic experts, were already in the apartment. A mysterious young man, who likely had some connection to the crime, entered the apartment. It seemed his arrival was a real relief, as the others were glad to see him. At this point, it was already known that the daughter of one of the victims had reported what had happened. Moreover, when the people entered the place, the bodies were completely clean, just like the entire house. This led to the conclusion that the criminal had been in the house for a long time, as he had managed to clean up and had the opportunity to do so. What was happening resembled similar crimes in Chunoldong and Sinpyeong, as the method of killing was the same and the distance between the cities wasn't far. Additionally, there was one common detail: the clean bodies and the crime scene, leading to the conclusion that the killer was the same person. Therefore, the men began to ponder what to do next. It was crucial to come up with a logical plan at that stage to find the killer and protect future victims. This idea struck the man as he remembered that surveillance cameras covered 3 areas and were located not far from the crime scene, so it was possible to find people connected to the crime. Meanwhile, the mysterious man was sitting behind the wheel of a car, driving too fast. He was listening to the radio, which was broadcasting urgent news about the murders in Chuholdong, Sinpyeong, and Jungjong. It was clear that the crimes that occurred there were as brutal and bizarre as to shock everyone. Furthermore, it was established that the perpetrator was alone and an investigation had begun. Additionally, a close-up photo of the criminal was published, and a huge reward of 10 million won was offered to anyone who could find him and report to the police. Moreover, the police promised to do everything possible to catch him as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the mysterious man arrived at the planned location and was stretching his muscles by his car. When he finished, he pulled out a cigarette and was about to light it. The man was surprisingly calm, as he was hiding some terrible secret. Suddenly, he climbed into his own car. He took the car out of gear, allowing it to roll down the hill. Then he calmly watched as his car rolled toward the cliff, soon to be destroyed forever. It seemed such an act was entirely justified, and he was preparing for it. After all, it was the only way to cover up the traces of the crime and protect himself from being pursued. The car began to sink in the water. It became clear that the man was not an ordinary tourist and had something to hide. After all, an ordinary person would never take such a step and would not easily destroy their own car as he did. The guy looked at the settlement on the other side of the river, at the empty streets and many ruined and abandoned houses. He concluded that nothing had changed in that place, and everything remained as it had been for a long time. Also, noticing another interesting detail, he reached an incredible conclusion. The sacred tree that had stood in the settlement for many years had been cut down. The person who destroyed that sacred symbol seemed to not even realize what they had done. After all, such an act required a lot of effort because the tree protected the entire village and the shrine. While pondering the fate of the sacred tree in the settlement, the guy didn't notice the strange man standing behind him. He began to ask the guy who he was and what he was doing in their settlement at such a time. When the guy didn't respond and just silently stared into his eyes, the man began to get angry and raised his voice. Suddenly, the guy turned around and stopped in front of the resident. He asked if the man was a resident of the settlement and how he had managed to find him. Suddenly, the man began to scream wildly, his eyes filled with blood, and it seemed he was ready to kill the guy who had intruded on his territory. But this couldn't rattle the hero. He remained calm and just silently watched as the old man got angrier. Suddenly, he heard the voice of a girl running toward them. It was clear that she was the daughter of the furious man, and she immediately began to apologize for his behavior. It became evident that her father was not in his right mind, and at that moment she was trying to take him away and calm him down. And it worked, as hearing about food immediately calmed the man down, and it seemed like nothing had happened. Also, the girl was about to talk to the hero and asked her father to wait for her. Right away, she began to apologize again for her father's behavior, understanding that he might have frightened the stranger. However, the guy denied everything and assured her that everything was fine and he wasn't offended by him. The girl noticed his backpack and assumed he was a traveler, but the guy replied that he had recently moved to the area and planned to settle in their settlement soon. With his words, he once again drew the attention of the sick man. Moreover, the girl looked at him with surprise. After all, she didn't understand how someone could move with just one suitcase. Obviously, it would take much more stuff. But to divert attention from himself, the man began to convince her that he was the grandson of one of the residents of the settlement, to which the girl continued to bombard him with questions. So the guy told her about his grandmother named Kim Jun's-ja. However, from the girl's reaction, it was clear she had never heard that name before and immediately began to think, trying to remember. Suddenly, with horror, she realized that the woman had been dead for 3 years. Looking at the guy's face, she saw that he immediately became sadder. After all, he was trying to pretend he knew nothing about her death, and it seemed he was doing a good job of it. However, unexpectedly, the guy smiled. This frightened the girl a lot, as he said he was just joking. Moreover, she didn't understand how someone could joke like that and not feel any guilt or shame. Additionally, she clearly remembered the face and was sure she hadn't seen the unknown guy at the woman's funeral. Therefore, she had quite logical doubts that the guy could be an imposter and really didn't know any Kim Jong's-ja, especially that he had never been her grandson. But the guy started to wriggle out of it again and said he indeed hadn't attended her funeral. Also, he seemed angry at the girl, thinking such questions shouldn't have been asked. The girl was angry because she didn't understand what could be more important that day than the funeral of a loved one. And it was very important for her to find out the real reason, especially since the unknown man intended to live in her house. Suddenly, the guy laughed out loud, and the girl in turn was shocked by his behavior. She was upset, as she saw nothing funny in her words. Moreover, the guy thought he wasn't the only one who hadn't been at the funeral. He spoke about certain reasons and assured her that the elders in the settlement could confirm his words. Suddenly, behind the girl, an old man's shout was heard. He showed the girl a huge snake he had caught in the grass. The snake was trying to escape, writhing terribly in his hands. Meanwhile, the guy was preparing to leave the father and his daughter. He left behind only a pile of questions. And the girl was trying to remember his grandmother, analyzing every word he said, as the guy was indeed very strange. Meanwhile, the guy was trying to find his grandmother's spare key. He was shocked because it wasn't in the usual place where it could be. However, after a few attempts, he finally managed to find it. His grandmother had hidden the key in the most remote spot so that no one could reach it. Still, after finding the key, the man tried to enter his grandmother's house. Opening the door, he saw that everything inside was perfectly in order, and the lights were even on. Moreover, water was running from the faucet, which meant everything was working and in good condition. The guy continued to check all the electrical appliances in the house. To his surprise, everything was working perfectly, and he couldn't understand why. Why, after such a long time, everything in the house was functioning and remained in perfect condition. Furthermore, the biggest surprise was that both water and electricity were working. Suddenly, the man realized what mistake he had made at that moment and immediately turned off the light. Drawing his weapon, he prepared and hid as he expected to be attacked at any moment. The perfect cleanliness in the house only meant that someone had been living there all the time. However, he didn't understand who could be hiding in the house and how an unwanted guest could have gotten in. Suddenly, he heard some suspicious noise outside. Turning his attention to it, he realized that it could be the people who had been living in his grandmother's house for the past 3 years returning. So, hiding his weapon behind his belt, he decided to check who those people were and what the noise outside was about. Calmly, he headed toward the gate, hoping to drive away the unknown people, but still prepared for the worst and remained vigilant. Outside, a whole crowd of men had gathered, their appearance showing they were determined. Suddenly, the locked gate opened. The hero, the true heir and descendant of the dead woman, stepped out to meet them. Before him stood the village elder, No Seok Dae, who wanted to talk to the hero and find out who he was and what he was doing in the house. He also inquired whether the guy was indeed the grandson of the woman and noted that the gates had been locked, so it was strange that he had managed to get inside. However, the hero did not respond, only staring intently at the faces of the strangers. He didn't understand what they wanted to achieve with their visit, as he had no intention of leaving the house, let alone explaining anything to them. Suddenly, one of the guests began to shout, outraged that the guy was ignoring the elder and not answering his questions. But immediately, the elder intervened in the argument and calmed both of them down. He assured them that the purpose of his visit was simply to talk and that they meant no harm. He was only interested in how the guy had gotten inside the house and what his true purpose for visiting was. However, the hero had no intention of answering. On the contrary, he began to ask many questions. Thus, he tried to divert suspicion away from himself. But he didn't realize that this could only irritate the men more. Moreover, he kept repeating that he was indeed the grandson of the dead woman. At that moment, one of the villagers grabbed him by the neck and accused him of being rude to the village elder. He didn't like the guy's behavior and the disrespect with which he spoke. In response, he received only a smile from the hero. It was clear that this didn't scare him at all, and the elder was impressed by such audacity. Meanwhile, the hero continued to laugh, ignoring the angry crowd in front of him. Suddenly, his assailant prepared to strike. However, the guy managed to anticipate him, and to stop him, he had to hit back with his head. This made the attacker scream in pain. His nose was broken, and his head hurt terribly. Moreover, the guy accused the man of rudeness, and his actions could be recognized as self-defense. The guy also realized one important thing, that despite their friend being hurt, none of them reacted at all and didn't even try to defend or help. And he was convinced that it was the elder's fault, as everyone could be waiting for orders from him or were simply afraid of him. The elder addressed the man named Hyun and asked how long he planned to lie on the ground. Strangely, he simply got up and apologized to the elder. At that moment, the old man approached the hero, stopped in front of him, and examined him closely. He said that one of his men had acted poorly and was actually apologizing on his behalf. He also laughed slyly, and at that moment his behavior seemed the most bizarre. Moreover, he continued to stare intently at the boys' faces and didn't stop smiling. He said he had been able to see him well and recognize him. After that, he ordered his men to return to the settlement, as he was convinced that the hero was indeed the grandson of that same woman. After his words, everyone turned around without further questions and prepared to leave. But the guy, who understood nothing and remained standing in shock by the gate, made them stop. He spoke about how his house was in very good condition, so it seemed that someone had been living there. However, the elder didn't believe the guy's words, as his grandmother had left without saying goodbye to her family. Therefore, to prevent the house from falling apart, the villagers helped each other in turn and could occasionally clean the house. When the guy understood everything, he was ready to let the elder and his men go. But Hyunsop couldn't calm down. He couldn't believe that the guy would just be allowed to live in that house. To dispel his protégé's doubts, the elder made him look at the roof of the building where the main character was staying. What Hyunsop saw there terrified him greatly. It was the spirit of some kind of monster. Moreover, the elder was very pleased because the monster was dancing with joy, full of enthusiasm. So it could be considered that the matter was settled, and the men had no grievances against the boy. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the same girl appeared, the daughter of the crazy old man. However, the boy didn't notice her and was lost in thought about what had happened the day before and the people who had come to see him. But he realized he had left his pack of cigarettes inside. Just as he was about to head back, he suddenly heard a familiar voice and saw the girl running toward him. She asked what the elder wanted with him, but he didn't answer and only asked her about cigarettes, hoping she smoked too. He also thought that the girl might have told the elder about what happened, which was why he had come to see him. But she was adamant in denying any involvement and insisted she had nothing to do with his visit. However, the hero didn't get angry with her and tried to show his kindness in every way he could. But the woman couldn't calm down and kept asking the boy about the recent visit. The hero found her behavior suspicious and explained that the men wanted to make sure he was really who he claimed to be. Suddenly, the woman got nervous and was about to leave. The only thing she said was that the boy would soon regret it. After that, she silently walked away, leaving the hero alone with his thoughts. But it seemed he didn't care and wasn't even planning to stop her. So after a while, she stopped on her own. Breathing heavily, she realized she hadn't said everything and couldn't just let the boy go. She knew she risked never seeing him again, so she called out to him again and made him stop. She understood that the boy had come empty-handed and had no belongings with him. So she thought it would be reasonable to at least bring him a pillow. It seemed the boy didn't mind, so she rushed back home while he was left waiting. She didn't know if the hero would wait for her but it was the only thing she could do for him. Meanwhile, the boy was completely confused. He continued to wait for the girl, curious about what she really wanted from him. After a while, he heard a commotion at his gate again. He understood it was the girl returning with a pillow for him. When he met her, he saw disappointment on her face because, in reality, he hadn't waited for her. At the same time, the girl brought him a pillow and a blanket, convinced he didn't have any. The girl's behavior raised many questions for the hero, and he couldn't understand why she was doing this. It was all very strange since the woman had been scolding him the day before. His words shocked the girl, and for a moment she stood silently, unable to say anything. But eventually she apologized for her behavior and admitted she suspected him of deceit. It seems she simply felt sorry for him and wanted to make amends. So she extended her things to the man, hoping he would accept them. The boy, in despair, took her pillow and blanket. After that, the girl simply ran away, offering no explanation. She quickly distanced herself from the boy, feeling an incredible shame for her recent behavior. But suddenly, she turned back and decided to look him in the eye again. To her surprise, she realized the boy was still watching her and hadn't moved from his spot. But in reality, the hero was just trying to figure out what had happened. After a while, he entered his new place. His mind was troubled, and he couldn't connect the events that had occurred the day before. As he considered various scenarios, he even started to feel anxious. He also thought about the girl, her visit, and the gift. He found her behavior and kindness strange. He was also plagued by suspicions, so he decided to check the contents of the pillow and blanket. Immediately, he cut open the pillow, trying to find a hidden microphone or some other device. To his surprise, he actually found a very interesting object inside, well, the origin of which he didn't understand yet. Meanwhile, a new day dawned in the settlement. The hero, as usual, went through his morning routine and listened to the news. Moreover, exercising was a mandatory and special ritual for him. He paid great attention to physical exercises and took his health and physical condition seriously. So, physical exercise was something more for him than just a daily routine. After exercising, he took care of his skin and face, which also held great personal significance for him. He couldn't forget about the events that had happened to him the previous night and couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious piece of paper. The scene shifted to a chicken farm belonging to some household in the settlement. There were quite a few chickens, therefore someone had to constantly feed them and keep an eye on them. It became clear that it was Hyun-seop, though it was unclear why, but he was catching chickens from a cage. However, when he finished, he was noticed by a man who was likely the owner of the chickens. Hyun-seop explained his crime by saying that the elder needed a white chicken. But the owner didn't like that, as his chickens had been taken before, and he didn't understand what made his chickens so special. The man believed that chickens could be bought in town and didn't need to be stolen, as that was illegal. However, Hyun-seop shot him a nasty look and accused him of not following the elder's orders and daring to contradict his words. Although the man was scared, he insisted on his point, believing that his chickens were his property and he shouldn't have to share them. Still, the thief couldn't hold back and began to accuse the man, openly threatening him. He advised the old man to just let him go and not create problems for anyone. Meanwhile, the hero's morning routine continued, and he decided to go for a run. He decided to sprint the short distance that lay ahead at maximum speed. However, his strength quickly left him, and he realized he couldn't go on. Previously, he could run much faster and longer, so he blamed his loss of endurance on smoking. In general, it was pointless to talk about the harm it caused, and the boy understood that perfectly well, but nothing could be changed. Suddenly, he witnessed a quarrel between two men over a chicken. Hyun-seop didn't want to pay the reward for the animal as the man requested, and also didn't want to return it to its owner. So, unable to withstand the man's words, he simply hit him, nearly killing the poor animal. The man lay on the ground in a pile of feathers. He was shocked and deeply disappointed. At that moment, Hyun-seop froze and couldn't move. After what had happened, he was simply left speechless. The thing was, behind the man, he saw the elder, who had accidentally witnessed everything and appeared out of nowhere. The elder was very angry, and it became clear that Hyun-seop was in for big trouble. The elder expressed his concern to the man, as he had been absent for a very long time. The man realized he was in trouble and didn't know how to explain what had happened. The elder began to scold Hyun-seop, as he couldn't control himself, and his actions could anger the mother. He also addressed the victim by name, Song-sik, and asked how he was feeling. Concerned, Hyun-seop didn't know how he could face his mother and what to do to keep her from getting angry. Meanwhile, the elder wanted to pay the man for the chicken and tried to find out its price. But Hyun-seop insisted on his point. He was willing to do anything and sought advice from the elder. But the man believed that the person who committed the crime should bear the responsibility for it, so he couldn't decide or determine the punishment. At that moment, the hero witnessed quite a strange scene that amused him. He noticed that Hyun-sup began to hit himself. He was pleading with his mother not to be angry, as he had already started punishing himself and intended to continue until her anger subsided. The blows continued, and Jong-sik watched in surprise at what was happening. But at that moment, he was about to leave. The boy, who was enjoying a beautiful day and witnessing an unusual event, heard footsteps behind him. It was the same girl, and seizing the moment, he asked how long it had been so lively in the village. From her response, it became clear that it hadn't always been this way. She was convinced that they didn't have to watch what was happening and that it would be better to go to a safer and quieter place. The boy didn't understand what she was planning again and didn't rush to get up and follow her this time. However, she didn't understand why he was waiting and not listening to her, and suddenly she heard a question about the events of the previous day and what had really happened. After all, he found it quite strange that the woman was so interested in him and constantly tried to find him. It also became clear that she was happy when she heard that the boy would be staying in their settlement for a long time. The very fact that the boy decided to stay in the settlement made her act this way. But the boy, interrupting her, reached into his pocket. From there, he pulled out the item the girl had placed in the pillow and held it right in front of her face. Seeing this, the girl was very surprised and blushed, as she hadn't expected the boy to find that object. She explained that she was just checking it, as it was hard for her to trust someone unfamiliar. But the object didn't resemble a microphone or a listening device. Rather, it looked like some kind of talisman or charm. Unable to hold back, the boy asked again why the girl had given him that object. At that moment, the girl began to sweat, realizing that her answer might not please the boy. Moreover, she worried that he might simply not believe her, as the truth sounded like nonsense. Still, the girl gathered her courage to explain that it was a talisman that protected against the ghosts that infested the entire settlement. Taking it in both hands and holding it out in front of the girl, the boy asked if she had brought it into the house because she was truly afraid of ghosts. And without waiting for an answer, he simply tore it apart in front of her eyes. Unable to contain herself, she began to yell at the boy, as she couldn't understand the motive behind his actions, especially why he would destroy the object. But the man explained that the thing was that he didn't believe in such shamanic tricks and that ghosts didn't exist in principle. Thanking the girl for her attention, he was about to leave. And the boy simply crumpled her protective charm. He also intended to throw it away, as a torn charm couldn't be effective. At that moment, the ruined object fell to the ground. Saying goodbye to the woman, he promised to let her know if he ever saw a ghost with his own eyes. However, deep down, he believed that would never happen, while the girl watched him leave and regretted that she had sincerely wanted to help him. Night fell in the settlement. The same man, the owner of the farm, was busy with his own affairs in his yard. Seong-sik couldn't calm down because the chicken thief had hit him and hadn't even received a response or any reasonable punishment. However, he flinched when he saw the elder, and that thought greatly pleased Seong-sik. He continued to sit and think about a plan for revenge and what punishment his opponent deserved. In his mind, he replayed possible dialogue scenarios and got angry that they looked down on him. Suddenly, he swung at a chicken that was just passing by. With one swift motion, he managed to behead the chicken and take its life. However, this didn't make him feel any better, as he imagined Hyun-sup in place of the unfortunate animal. What he did to the chicken seemed right to him at that moment. Moreover, he firmly decided to take revenge on Hyun-sup and was preparing to set out in search of him. Seong-sik simply couldn't allow anyone to dare insult him. Rising, the man set out to find him. He knew the place where Hyun-sup lived or might be, and that was where he intended to check. Arriving at his house, he began to call out his name, hoping to be heard and responded to. He was also smiling and looked very pleased, as he was happy that he would soon take revenge on his tormentor. The man also added that he had come to collect money for the chicken that had been attempted to be taken from him. So, he was about to enter the yard and had already started to open the door. He looked very focused and was ready to kill his victim without the slightest hesitation. So he pulled hard on the handle and pulled the door toward him. At that moment, Hyun-sup, who heard a strange noise behind his fence, decided to check what was really going on. His astonishment knew no bounds when he saw the same old man in his yard in the middle of the night. Moreover, he was armed and determined, and he had no intention of negotiating. Seong-sik kept laughing and looked very frightening. But the man couldn't understand what Seong-sik wanted from him and didn't expect that he might actually attack him. He also knew that after such an act, Seong-sik could be severely punished, as he would tear his mother apart. However, it became clear that the old man wasn't thinking about that, as revenge and retribution were his top priorities. He was convinced that his tormentor deserved to face consequences, and the punishment he had assigned himself was insufficient. Suddenly, he attacked Hyun-seo and was about to inflict serious wounds on him. The man couldn't believe his eyes. He wasn't prepared for such a turn of events. He had to act decisively, as he risked getting mortally wounded, so he managed to dodge. Next, he tried to grab the old man's hand and wrest the knife away from him. But the old man wouldn't give up and kept trying to strike his opponent, aiming to inflict serious harm. He was determined to stab him and take revenge for how he had been treated. When the man couldn't wrest the knife from his attacker, he attempted to throw him to the ground and tripped him. Seong-sek began to lose his balance as the man pressed down on him with his body weight. Still, the knife slipped from his hands and lay on the ground nearby. The confrontation between the two men escalated into a full-blown fight. Hyun-seo, who had previously had a good relationship with the old man, was convinced that his feelings had changed forever, as the old man dared to wave a knife and wanted to kill him. So he started punching the man in the nose and face, trying to inflict as much damage as possible. He also thought the man was a psycho and was clearly going through a tough time. He was incredibly angry and continued to beat the old man with all his might. Moreover, he didn't pay attention to the fact that his opponent was much older and powerless, unable to resist. The event shifted to the main character's home. The next morning, he got ready for his usual walk and started warming up. Suddenly, he saw the same girl by his gate, sitting and waiting for him. Seeing her, he was taken aback, as he hadn't expected her to show up after what had happened. He asked the girl about the purpose of her visit. From her words, it became clear that there was a gathering in the settlement, called specifically because of the boy's arrival. And the boy didn't understand what he could have done that was so bad, or if it was really that important. But without understanding anything, he saw the girl grab his hand and start pulling him along. She said they had very little time, and the gathering had already started. She also mentioned that they absolutely had to be there and everyone had been waiting for them. So, in a flash, they headed to the meeting place. The location was a large building, something like a school that could hold a lot of people. However, before entering, the girl stopped. She told the boy that he needed to agree with everything and not act suspiciously. After that, they were ready to go inside and become part of the gathering. In front of them stood the village elder and his followers, who stopped talking when they saw the hero. It was clear that they had been waiting for their arrival for a long time and sighed in relief when it finally happened. The hero asked the girl who the elder really was, as he acted like a king, and it was very strange that all the men in the settlement obeyed him. The boy also accused the elder of disrupting his schedule, as he had to waste his own time to attend the meeting. At that moment, the elder lit a cigarette and apologized to the hero. His behavior raised concerns among his followers. However, the elder ignored their judgment and silently continued smoking. Suddenly, he asked what role the boy intended to play for their settlement. But the hero didn't understand a word and didn't know how to behave. The elder continued speaking and suggested he join their crime-fighting group, which aimed to prevent any wrongdoing in their village. But the hero didn't like that initiative at all and immediately refused. This drew disapproving looks from the men. All the men immediately glared at him with noticeable anger, as his behavior seemed too audacious. The girl was also shocked by his behavior and that he could simply refuse without obeying the elders. The boy also said he had come to the settlement to live peacefully, after which he turned to leave. Immediately, accusations flew toward the elder, as he hadn't even tried to stop him. The men were angry at the boy for refusing to listen to them and believed he had no right to live with them in the same settlement. However, the elder began to calm them down. After his words, the nervous and worried men looked at him, waiting to see what would happen next. The elder decided to leave the boy to his mother, as he didn't know what to do with him. He also noticed that Seong-sik was absent from the gathering and asked Hyun-seo why he was missing. But the man didn't respond and became even more anxious. However, he understood that he couldn't just stay silent and explain that they had fought the previous night. To his surprise, the elder replied that he had done a good thing, as he had saved the man in that way. Then all the men and the elder sat in silence. Finally, the gathering could be considered over, as the elder planned to be alone to pray. But everyone noticed that the girl wasn't returning to the gathering and wasn't participating in the discussion. In fact, she was trying to catch up with the hero and wanted to convince him to come back. But the boy didn't stop and had no desire to talk to her. Still, she managed to catch up with him and said it was already noon. She also asked what the boy's name was, as she didn't know how to address him. He replied that his name was Hyo-myung, Hearing this, the girl smiled. Immediately, she started yelling at the boy, accusing him of leaving the gathering so easily, as she had warned him to agree with everything. However, the boy didn't understand the importance of her words, as he was convinced he didn't have to help others and planned to live only for himself. He also fell silent and prepared to light a cigarette, but the girl was convinced that living comfortably could only be achieved in one way, specifically by not contradicting the words of the elders and listening to them, as otherwise there could be terrible consequences. But the hero was indifferent to her words. He didn't hear her and didn't believe a word. To him, it was nonsense, just like her stories about spirits. Meanwhile, the events shifted to the elder's house, where he was praying. On the table next to the figurines and icons sat a live chicken. It seemed he was conducting some secret ritual, or perhaps even performing a sacrifice. His prayer was something terrifying. His gaze and movements were so mysterious that they sent chills down one's spine. It seemed that for the chicken, everything was about to come to an end, as it was to become the victim of an incomprehensible ritual. After a while, it all ended, and the man killed the chicken. The entire room and the statues were covered in blood. However, the ritual didn't end there. The worst was yet to come. The elder smeared his body and eyes with the blood of the dead animal. While doing so, he thanked and praised the mother for salvation. Meanwhile, an unknown car was driving down the night highway. Behind the wheel was a man who looked very tired, having had a long day. In the passenger seat sat his son, who dreamed of becoming a police officer just like his father. But the man assured him that his job was very hard and dangerous, so the boy should think of a different profession for the future. However, the boy wanted nothing more than to protect his mom and dad, so he truly dreamed of such a job, and he was determined to punish anyone who dared to disturb his family. The father told the boy about an anonymous police officer who could easily deal with any wrongdoers, and they could decide the punishment for people. Moreover, by choosing this profession, the boy committed to studying hard and getting good grades in law school. Suddenly, the woman turned to the man with concern. Up ahead, she noticed a car trying to back out of a street. The driver of the truck might not see them, and at that moment, he accelerated. Suddenly and very quickly, he blocked the way of the sedan, causing an emergency situation. The collision was unavoidable, as the road was too narrow. Therefore, the man shouted for his family members to brace for impact. She hugged her son close, shielding him with her own body. And then, the terrible collision happened. As a result of the accident, the man's car was severely damaged, the glass was shattered, and everyone inside sustained serious injuries. The car was also violently spun around, and only by a miracle did it not flip over and remained on the road. Moreover, it continued to move and spin in the middle of the road. Eventually, it came to a stop after crashing into a sturdy guardrail. After a while, the culprits of the terrible accident began to approach the car to check if there were still living people inside. Fortunately, the child was unharmed, as the woman had shielded him with her own body, thus saving his life. He tried to call out to his parents, who, on the contrary, had sustained serious injuries and were unconscious. The culprits of the accident tried to bring the father back to consciousness, so they began to slap and shake him. When the man regained consciousness, the question arose of what to do next. Also, the unknown people were behaving very strangely. Due to the darkness outside, it was hard to make out their faces, but it was clear that they were smiling and looking at the woman with the child. From their words, it became clear that they wanted to kill the woman, but they couldn't decide what to do with the child. Not wanting to deal with the woman, one of the unknowns presented her with a shovel to her neck and was about to kill her. He intended to do it quickly, and even the fact that the boy was watching didn't stop him. He only wished for the woman to go to heaven. Suddenly, Hyo-myung woke up. It was again his nightmarish dream. Meanwhile, the events shifted to Song-sik's home. His wife had prepared chicken broth for breakfast and wanted to treat her husband with it, but she witnessed that her husband was already drunk and started a scene about it. She was unhappy with the old man's behavior, especially since he wasn't reacting to her words at all. She was upset that he had started drinking again and had left home with a knife at night. She also accused him of negligence and irresponsibility toward his own life, as she was convinced that sooner or later he could get killed. Suddenly, the angry man looked at his wife. It was clear that he could no longer tolerate her words directed at him. But she continued, accusing him of constant conflicts with Hyun-seop. But suddenly, the man cut her off. He flipped over the food she had prepared and began smashing everything in his path. But the woman couldn't understand such a reaction, as it was known that Hyun-seop had previously defended him from their mother's wrath. However, Song-sik was convinced that his abuser had to face consequences for his actions. He also didn't want to give away his chickens anymore, and the elder, knowing what had happened, didn't intervene or resolve the issue. Unable to take it anymore, the man decided to leave home, remaining hungry. Meanwhile, the woman, incredibly anxious, began to apologize to her mother for her own behavior and Shang-sek's behavior. In the meantime, the man managed to find a better place where he could be alone and think everything over. He continued to drink. Downing one bottle of alcohol after another, Shang-sek sat alone on a bench in the park. He was very angry at everyone involved in his misery and planned to kill them all. Suddenly, he heard a very familiar voice. It was Ja-eun, who was casually walking through the park and ran into him. Immediately, she extended her basket to him, wanting to treat him. They were peaches, which she thought were fresh and very tasty, and she offered him to try them since the man had no snacks. But Shang-sik asked where she was going, as it wasn't the way to her home. At that moment, she told him about the newcomer who had recently settled in their settlement and lived alone, so she wanted to treat him to food. The man continued to drink and stared at the girl's face. Suddenly, he didn't like the expression she had while looking at him, and he became very angry. But it wasn't like that. The girl was scared and thought he had just drunk too much. He also accused her of planning to give the peaches to someone who had lived in the settlement for less than a week. Suddenly, he grabbed a knife and intended to hurt the girl, convinced that she was also trying to provoke him. The girl, shocked by such behavior, jumped to her feet and tried to calm the man down. Her voice sounded uncertain, and she watched as the man began to approach her. Therefore, to avoid getting into a dangerous situation, she grabbed the food and was about to leave. However, suddenly the man struck her with the knife and wounded her arm. Ja-eun dropped the basket of fruit and couldn't understand the reason for such behavior. But the man believed that the girl was simply ignoring him because of the unknown boy. He thought that since his arrival, everything in the settlement had become very strange. And suddenly the man began to scream, blaming the hero for all the troubles. He felt it was his duty to get rid of him and save the entire settlement. Hearing this, Ja-eun became very frightened, as she didn't understand what could happen next. Suddenly, the psycho lunged at her. Grabbing her by the hair, he tried to catch her and stop her. But somehow, the girl managed to break free. All that was left in Shang-sek's hands was a clump of her hair. He promised that he would chase her relentlessly and had no intention of letting this go easily. The girl desperately started to run, trying to escape from the man. However, he didn't fall behind and continued to pursue her. He kept smiling and shouting at her, demanding that she stop and surrender. Fortunately, he was old, so he didn't have enough strength to catch up with her. Still, he didn't relent, and the girl understood that he had lost his mind and was ready to kill her. So, in order to save her life, she ran toward Hyeomyong's house. She hoped that the guy would be home and would let her in. Immediately, she started banging on the door and screaming frantically for him, hoping he would protect her. But no one answered, and she watched in horror as the deranged man got closer. It was clear that this girl had nowhere to run, and if Hyeomyong didn't come out, she would be left alone with a dangerous, armed criminal. Seong-sek threatened that soon the girl would be heading to the heavens. He ignored her tears and pleas for him to leave her alone. Finally, he began to approach her. Ja-eun screamed desperately and started praying that the guy would hear her and save her. Suddenly, the crazed old man ran after the girl, wanting nothing more than to kill her. He began shouting as she irritated him, and soon she would die, like all the others who had become his enemies. The girl understood that she was doomed and no longer expected help. Just then, out of nowhere, a hero appeared and kicked the man, managing to stop him. The guy showed up at the last moment and miraculously saved the girl from certain death. She couldn't believe her eyes. The guy had become her savior. Shang-sik fell to the ground, feeling incredible pain all over his body. The hero, not understanding what was happening, asked why it was so noisy and why she had disturbed him. Then the girl explained that she could have become a victim of a madman, as he had injured her and was ready to slit her throat. Suddenly, the guy noticed the cut on her. He saw that she was very scared and was telling the truth, as blood was flowing from her deep wound. Hyeomyong decided to examine the wound and help the injured girl. First, he wiped the blood with his own towel. He did this very carefully so as not to cause her more pain. Suddenly, he heard the voice of the madman, and it seemed that he recognized the guy and knew he was new. So he decided to kill him too, and finally put an end to the madness that had taken over the settlement since his arrival. Hearing this, the guy exhaled heavily, realizing he had a new problem to deal with. The man was truly insane as he linked all the troubles in the settlement to the hero's arrival. Moreover, the guy hadn't expected to see him in such a state since morning. The guy thought the girl needed to go to the hospital to treat her wound. Suddenly, the man fell silent and became suspicious. He stood still, his head lowered. His eyes began to fill with blood, and he looked at the people in front of him with terrible malice. Suddenly, blood started pouring from his eyes. Soon he couldn't stand still and lunged at the hero and Ya-eun, swinging a knife. The hero, who was trying to stop the girl's bleeding, noticed the impending danger. He tried to protect himself and the girl's life, so he understood he needed to defend himself. Immediately, he tried to hit the man with the towel to knock him off balance. Besides, he knew that the old man had a broken nose, which was his weak spot, so a hit to the nose worked effectively. After that, the guy punched the man in the face. The kick was so strong that Song-sek began to lose his balance. Before long, he found himself back on the ground and couldn't get up for a long time. For a moment, the hero managed to stop him and save himself. But the old man didn't give up and tried to regain his composure and get back up. He groaned heavily, and his face was battered and terribly swollen. However, when he finally managed to get up, the girl, with horror on her face, tried to alert the hero. Hyo-myung didn't want to harm the old man, who wasn't his enemy, but he left him no choice. He wanted to call for help and inform the other residents of the situation, but it was too late. The old man was about to attack again and stood silently, staring at them. Hyo-myung found it very strange to observe such behavior, as he didn't know if this could end and what was going on in the sick old man's head. Moreover, he didn't understand where he got the strength to stay on his feet. So, he decided to attack first and was determined to end what had happened. Immediately, he began to quickly approach his opponent. After that, he struck him in the face with all his might. It seemed he was satisfied, as everything was going as it should. Next, he was going to hit the man using a special martial art technique. However, he realized that it could harm the old man and ruin his health, so he just hit him with the towel. But the blow was also quite strong, causing him to lose his balance. And after a trip, he ended up on the ground. Once again, the madman found himself on the ground with a broken nose and a swollen face. But he didn't even think of giving up, so he tried to get up again. His attempt was unsuccessful, as he had lost a lot of strength, and blood from his eyes and nose was flooding his face. The main hero was very determined and didn't want to let the old man go. He understood that the old man could come back and slit the girl's throat, or his in the middle of the night. He decided to take matters into his own hands and was going to strangle the helpless man. So, throwing the towel around his neck, he began to squeeze with all his strength. But Song-sik resisted and tried to break free. He even managed to scratch the guy's face. In a fit of rage, the hero tried to strangle the old man even harder. Eventually, Song-sek's strength began to wane. His breathing became heavy, and his resistance weakened. The girl understood that the guy could kill him this way and tried to shout at him. But he didn't stop and continued to squeeze and choke the man. Finally, he felt satisfied and began to smile. And Song-sek, lacking air, lost consciousness and stopped resisting. Ja-yeon was very scared, as despite what Song-sek had done, she didn't wish for his death. So the hero released the man and stopped choking him, and his body fell to the ground. Finally, the guy could breathe a sigh of relief, as their confrontation could be considered over. After the man didn't respond, the girl ran to her savior. She was worried about his health and hoped that he wasn't injured. She also hoped that the old man was alive and that nothing would happen to him. However, Hyo-myung was angry with her, as he didn't understand how it all started and what had really happened. And the frightened girl tried to explain how everything had unfolded. The thing was, Song-sek continued to attack even after he lost consciousness. Moreover, he aimed for the eyes even when he was being choked. The main hero had never encountered such situations before and didn't understand how this could happen. However, the girl realized with horror that the man could have been possessed by a spirit. But her version seemed like nonsense to the hero, despite the fact that the girl had witnessed what had happened. The girl tried to convince the guy of the existence of ghosts, showing him her injury. She also tried to explain that there were indeed supernatural forces in the settlement that were very dangerous for ordinary people. And blood from her wound dripped onto the ground, right at her feet. She didn't stop talking and said that there were an incredible number of ghosts. Suddenly, something truly incomprehensible began to happen with the bloodstain in front of her. Her head spun sharply, and she almost lost consciousness herself. And then she felt an overwhelming weakness, and a sudden rush of air swept through her legs, causing her hair to helplessly flutter in the air. She also felt something strange, and some force began to pull her along. Moreover, she noticed something odd right behind her. So, she ran in that direction, trying to find out what was really happening. The guy couldn't understand anything and was shocked by what was happening. He even began to get angry at her for her behavior. Besides not believing a word about ghosts, he didn't understand what strange things were happening in the settlement. He wasn't sure he had his sanity intact, and with everything that had happened recently, he risked losing it completely. Overwhelmed by heavy thoughts, he also felt a sharp pain in his head and ringing in his ears. And to avoid falling, he had to hold onto the fence. He just wanted to be left alone and not bothered anymore. When the girl stopped in front of the place where the unknown force had led her, she saw nothing. But to make sure something mystical was happening, she began to dig into the ground beneath her. The guy, who was witnessing her incomprehensible behavior, was seriously nervous and even scared. However, the girl didn't listen to him and continued to dig. She felt that she was supposed to find something, and her vision was not simple. Finally, when the hole was deep enough, she began to feel some object under her fingers. Peering inside, she was shocked and genuinely terrified. What she found could forever change her life and the lives of those living in the settlement. Suddenly, she came to her senses and realized she remembered nothing. She was also stunned by what she had done. The girl was convinced she hadn't done anything, but the mud on her hands and the guy's words told a different story. She truly didn't understand how she managed to do this, especially to find the mysterious object. The object she found was a ritual of Azazel, conducted since ancient times. However, the hero didn't understand how a jar wrapped in a strange ribbon could end up on his property. Moreover, he didn't know what such a strange find could mean. But the girl explained that the jar was meant for a ritual, and she couldn't understand how it could have appeared in the guy's house. So in order to rid the jar of any evil energy that might be in it, she planned to burn it. Suddenly, the angry guy approached the girl. He had a ton of questions and didn't want to waste time on things he didn't understand, so he struck the jar with all his might. Ja-yoon couldn't withstand the strong blow and dropped the jar. It shattered as it wasn't sturdy, and Ja-eun, who was shocked by the guy's audacious behavior, began to yell at him. However, understanding the seriousness of the problem, she almost cried. The hero remained calm and didn't pay any attention to what had happened. Inside, he saw raw rice and a severed chicken head. The girl started screaming, as now they had no way to burn the jar and all its contents. Moreover, she was angry at the guy for not understanding the seriousness of the problem and not believing her words. Additionally, he was planning to walk away to finally sort everything out and just wanted to mind his own business. Suddenly, at the sight of the broken jar, the girl noticed a horrifying sight. A mass of evil energy began to rise from the jar. After that, a large mass of dark energy entered the guy. And he, not understanding anything, didn't even notice how it happened. However, he felt an unpleasant chill throughout his body. His head spun, and he didn't understand what was really happening. He only heard the girl scream and turned to her, asking what she wanted. And she, in turn, didn't understand how it all started and where the massive dark energy had gone. After a while, the guy and the girl decided to return to the man, who continued to lie unconscious on the street. However, they were horrified to realize that he was no longer there. He could be anywhere, so the girl thought they should warn all the residents of the settlement. But the guy thought differently and wanted someone to check the girl's cut. He also wondered how the girl knew about the buried jar in his garden, but she didn't understand anything and denied everything. It seemed the hero began to suspect her, as she had previously placed a sacred talisman on him. The guy said it was very interesting to observe the events, and he didn't even notice how he was being watched. The man felt that he was about to be killed and soon he would die. So, he decided to run away and leave the settlement to save his own life. Still, the people decided to hold another meeting to figure out what had really happened. The elder was going to listen to the victim and knew that the man had been waving a knife the day before. All the men gathered inside were ready to express their opinions about what had happened. However, everyone unanimously said that Seong-sik couldn't have done such a thing and accused the girl and the hero of lying. Glancing at each other, Hyo-myung and Ja-eun realized they were left alone with their problems. Moreover, they were accused of lying, which was very insulting and unacceptable. The guy decided to act decisively and tried to prove the man's involvement in what had happened the day before. So he grabbed the girl by the hand to show her injury and prove he was right. The elder immediately asked where Seong-sik had been at that moment and why he wasn't at the meeting. But the hero replied that he was with him while he was treating Ja-eun's wound. Therefore, the elder ordered his subordinates to bring the suspect to him. Right away, Hyun-soo volunteered to do it, as he also felt no fondness for the old crook. However, it was unclear how the people were supposed to overcome the difficulties that had arisen in the settlement recently. Moreover, the suspect's wife tried to prove his innocence and vehemently denied any accusations against him. But her words meant nothing, as Hyun-sep and another man set off to search for the suspect. The hero couldn't calm down and kept raising the girl's hand so everyone would finally notice her cut. This behavior surprised her. She hadn't expected him to help her, let alone continue to defend her after the incident. Next, the elder wanted to decide what to do with the criminal upon his return. But Ja-eun beat him to it and suggested calling the police. After all, she believed the old man's actions could be seen as an attempt on her life, and the matter was quite serious. Suddenly, she felt a strange chill spread through her body. It seemed she could no longer control her words and actions, as if something had taken over her. Meanwhile, the elder silently watched the girl, contemplating every word she said. But he couldn't refuse her, so he promised to do everything as she wished. Suddenly, the boy released the girl's hand when he realized the matter was settled. But then, the girl changed her answer, saying that the settlement's affairs should be handled by her mother. She said it so uncertainly that it felt like she had been forced to say it. At that moment, the hero looked at her, confused about her stance, hoping the police would sort things out. After a while, the search for the criminal yielded no results. The meeting had already ended, but people weren't in a hurry to leave and lingered outside the building. The hero, unable to make sense of what was happening, hid or eavesdropped on the men's conversation. Suddenly, he spotted the elder and couldn't resist the tempting idea of eavesdropping on everything. He witnessed the suspect's wife trying to persuade the elder to pardon him. She was angry at the hero for the fact that the elder and all the other villagers believed him. But the man spoke of the chance the mother had given the criminal and how he hadn't taken it, continuing to commit crimes. However, the woman kept insisting and trying to save her husband. Finally, the elder replied that the only one to blame for what happened was Seong-sik, who had lost his chance to redeem himself. And for his actions, he deserved to be punished. The lady continued to try to justify her husband, believing he had already left the settlement. However, as was known, no one had ever succeeded in doing that. Having heard enough, the hero decided to take action and wasn't going to sit idly by. He resolutely decided to find the criminal quickly and tried to figure out what had happened. He knew nothing about the mother or why everyone was so afraid of her. Besides, he didn't believe in ghosts or any magical powers that Ja-eun constantly talked about. Meanwhile, it had grown dark in the settlement, and the search for the criminal was postponed until the next day. However, the suspect was trying to escape from the settlement. He was doing everything he could to get away and stay alive, avoiding his punishment. But in horror, he realized he was going in circles and couldn't find his way out of the forest. Suddenly, the exhausted old man stumbled over a rock. Painfully hitting the ground, he found himself on the ground. His weak body wouldn't cooperate, and out of sheer fear and a thirst for life, he kept crawling. After that, he realized that all his efforts were in vain, and he was doomed. He understood that there was no sense in his actions, as he hadn't even managed to reach the main road all day. He was sick and old, believing he remained his mother's son. He comforted himself, convinced that his mother couldn't be so cruel as to abandon him. He also reassured himself that he had been a good son and had done everything he was asked to do. Suddenly, he began to smile and took a deep breath. It seemed he started to understand, and his self-reassurance was doing him good. But nearby, he heard indistinct footsteps and became very frightened. Looking in the direction of the sound, he realized someone was approaching him. It was the hero to whom the old man spoke about unfinished business in the settlement and tried to return. But the boy wasn't listening. He was talking about needing to do something for him. Suddenly, he pulled out his weapon. At that moment, everything became clear to Seong-sik. So he began to prepare for the end of his life. Hyo-myung was convinced that the man didn't deserve to live and should end up in hell after death. Seong-sik insisted that his mind was clear and he understood how much pain his body was in. He also realized that the hero intended to harm him, so the old man tried to stop him. Moreover, he didn't understand what harm he could do to the hero and thought the girl was the cause of it all. He tried to prevent the conflict and wanted the boy to take him home. He was also convinced that the hero was following his mother's orders. But Hyo-myung ignored the man's words and wasn't going to waste any more time on talk. However, the man continued, saying that the boy couldn't have found him in the mountains by himself and couldn't know his whereabouts. This made the hero laugh. In response, he received a similar question about how the old man ended up in the forest. Also, the old man had to take responsibility for what happened that morning, as he had dared to attack unarmed people. Unable to bear the accusations, the man began to scream that he remembered nothing. But the boy didn't believe a word he said. He could see that the old man was very scared and slowly began to approach him. The old man, in turn, stood still and didn't react at all. It seemed he had resigned himself to his fate and was ready for whatever the young man had planned. Suddenly, the boy cut the man's arm with his own weapon. After that, he asked how he was feeling and if he was having fun. From the incredible pain, the old man began to scream, trying to free himself. But the boy wouldn't let him do that and was ready for any turn of events. Meanwhile, Hyunsop and his partner were trying to find the fugitive. They were also searching the mountains, knowing he wouldn't escape from there. Moreover, they believed this task wasn't particularly difficult and would soon encounter him. Suddenly, nearby, they heard a terrible scream of pain from the suspect they had been trying to find for so long. Immediately, the men began to listen closely, trying to determine from which direction it was coming. Having pinpointed the approximate location of the victim, they rushed to find him. Meanwhile, the confrontation between the hero and Song-sik continued, and the old man was doing everything he could to break free from the boy. But the hero knew the man was exhausted and was taking his time following his trail. He remained incredibly calm, having firmly decided to take revenge on the man for everything he had done. Seong-sik, for his part, was convinced that the boy was simply following No Seok-dae's orders and blamed him for what was happening. However, Hyo-myung no longer listened to him and didn't understand what he meant at all. But the old man continued to accuse him of serving the elder and carrying out his orders. Eventually, he managed to anger the boy, who was ready to end it all. The boy tried to speed up to catch up with his victim, and when he succeeded, he attempted to strike. Feeling the wound, the old man froze, his eyes wide with horror. He had received a serious injury to his back and began to bleed out slowly. At first, in a state of shock, he understood nothing. But after a while, his whole body felt incredible pain. He tried to speak, but his words came out as incoherent mumbling. But to ensure no one heard them, the boy tried to cover Song-sik's mouth with his hand, squeezing it with all his strength. He knew that a scream could cause him problems, as no one was supposed to know his intentions. He planned to pull the axe out of the victim's body and warned the man not to scream. Moreover, the hero didn't let go of his victim, and to make sure he understood, he ordered him to nod. When Song-sik did as the hero commanded, he tried to throw him to the ground and tripped him. As the man fell to the ground, the boy simultaneously yanked the axe from his back. After the fall, the victim felt particularly weak and, experiencing incredible pain, struggled to breathe. Moreover, he was trying to get up and was putting in an incredible amount of effort to do so. Hyo-myung was touched by his determination and struggle. Suddenly, he pointed to a tree just a few meters away from them. He wanted his victim to reach the tree on his own, and if he managed to do that, he planned to let him go. So, after a while, he gave the command to start, marking a new beginning in the fight for survival. Without wasting a second and exerting all his strength, the old man tried to rise. He succeeded, and his thirst for life was something incredible that truly impressed the young man. But the man wasn't going anywhere. Instead, he was pleading with his mother for help and apologizing for doubting her. He also wished death upon the main character, who was tormenting the mother's child. After that, he turned around and calmly headed toward the tree. As he turned his back to the main character, a large wound on his back was revealed. Suddenly, the main character spoke up. The thing was, there were certain limitations in his game, and the man could die before he reached the tree. Hearing this, the victim froze in place, unable to move. At that moment, Song-sik began to call the main character the harbinger of death. However, the main character couldn't understand what the man meant or what he was trying to say. The old man lay on the ground, motionless. The boy wanted to torment his victim further, but it seemed he wasn't the only one who had come for the old man's life. Behind him, the hero heard a sound. It was two men trying to make out something in the pitch-black darkness. But the boy realized he didn't have time to hide the man's body, and all he could do was hide in some nearby bushes to avoid being seen. In fact, the men had also heard the sound and were trying to determine its source. They were stumbling through the forest almost blindly, as nothing was visible in the complete darkness. However, once they reached an open area, they managed to find the corpse of the dead old man, who was already in the afterlife. Hyunsop seemed pleased to see his fierce enemy dead. Suddenly, his companion placed his own weapon on the ground. He remained serious while Hyunsop was celebrating and talking about how he felt this was bound to happen since their nighttime knife fight. Suddenly, his companion delivered an incredibly strong punch right to his face. This sent Hyunsop flying backward a good distance. He landed on the ground and couldn't regain his composure for a while, feeling immense pain and shock from the brutal blow. The man insisted that he should have shown respect for the dead, as their mother was watching over them. They also needed to pray and inform the village elder about what had happened. It seemed Hyunsop acknowledged his guilt and agreed with his companion's words. At the same time, the men began to pray, trying to atone for their sins. And Hyunsop, who was bleeding, had no choice but to join in the prayer as well. However, his companion insisted even more, leaving him no choice. Soon, raising his hands to the sky, Hyunsop began to recite the words of the prayer. The two stood over the corpse of the dead man, hands raised, murmuring incomprehensible words of prayer. At that moment, the hero realized that the murder of the man could be suspected from his wound if the police were called. Therefore, to save his own life and ensure his safety, he thought about getting rid of all the witnesses. He also understood that he had played with fire, and his adventure could end very badly for him. Meanwhile, the men called the elder and informed him that they had found the dead body of the old man. However, at that point, it was already clear that the old man had not died of natural causes and was likely murdered. After the elder's words, he promised to handle everything in the best way possible. Placing his hand on the corpse's head, he intended to fulfill No Sukde's request. Hyunsup asked what exactly needed to be done. He understood that the dead body needed to be burned or the soul needed to be appeased. This way, they could eliminate unnecessary noise and make it seem as if no one had ever found the man. Suddenly, the main character realized that this looked exactly like tampering with a crime scene, destroying evidence and disposing of a body. Analyzing this, he understood that the men were also committing a terrible crime. Meanwhile, the boy was planning to return to the settlement after everything that had happened. He seemed very satisfied and even hummed some incomprehensible melody to himself. Suddenly, nearby, under the tree, he saw a girl. It seemed very strange that she was outside at such a late hour, especially after what had just happened. So he decided to ask her what she was doing out there and why she was standing under the tree. But in turn, the girl also asked the boy what he was up to which he replied that he had been in town taking care of his own business. It seemed the girl had been waiting for him, and realizing this, the hero immediately asked her directly. However, she quickly began to deny any involvement and insisted that it wasn't what he thought. In reality, her mind was racing with thoughts, and she had decided to take a walk to distract herself somehow. She also noticed that the hero seemed very cheerful, and it appeared something pleasant had happened to him. Suddenly, the boy fell silent and made an unclear gesture with his fingers. However, he then replied that his mood had lifted after meeting her. His words made the girl blush, and in response, he asked again what she was doing outside. At that moment, the girl tried to explain. It seemed her thoughts were troubling her, and she was very nervous. She was tormented by the fact that she constantly looked rather strange. After all that had happened, she hadn't even called the police and didn't want to accuse her attacker. Suddenly, she realized she had said too much, and after that, she felt even worse. Lowering her head in front of the boy, she turned away, not wanting to show her emotions. But the main character understood everything, as he continued to watch her behavior closely. Suddenly, Ja-eun decided to leave and insisted that it was already late. But as she was leaving, the main character replied that he didn't think she was strange. He wanted to explain that everyone had their reasons for behaving a certain way, and he understood her perfectly because he was the same. Thanking him, the girl didn't dare to turn back to him and continued to walk away. She seemed very frightened and kept telling herself that what she had seen was just a figment of her imagination. So she saw that the spirit of the dead old man was bound to the body of the main character. Meanwhile, Hyunsop and his brother had built a fire and were trying to fulfill the last wishes of the deceased. The work was done and the men reported everything to the elder, but he remained unsatisfied. It seemed there was a will from the mother regarding the murder of the old man, but everything felt too eerie and strange. The men also had too many doubts about the truth of the situation, but the elder ordered them to return to the settlement once everything was ready. Hyunsop also didn't understand the elder's true intentions, but he continued to do his job and follow orders. After everything was burned, they needed to collect the ashes, climb to the top of the hill, and scatter them over the settlement. However, the men were still anxious and troubled by the question of who the real murderer of the man was. Immediately, they thought of the main character, who had recently settled in the settlement. No one doubted his involvement. After all, in light of recent events, it could be concluded that there had been a serious conflict between them, and the boy had every motive to commit the crime. But suddenly, the older brother turned to Hyunsuk. He placed a hand on his shoulder and was about to say something. The thing was, their work didn't allow for unnecessary questions, and they needed to do everything quickly and efficiently. Therefore, the topic was closed, as it wasn't part of their duties, and the police should handle the search for the murderer. So, after everything that had happened, they decided to have a drink later. Meanwhile, the elder was in his temple, preparing to perform a new prayer. He was addressing the statue and extending his hands toward it. He was tormented by the question of who that man really was, the one he couldn't even see. He was determined to see the one who was so cruel and had allowed himself to commit such a brutal act against the mother's child. He reached out his hands to the sculpture again and asked to see the face of that person. Suddenly, a true miracle occurred as he managed to glimpse a vision. Before him sat the deceased, next to the body of a chicken with its head cut off, holding a knife in his hands. His face, hands, and the murder weapon were covered in blood, and there was no doubt that he was the one who did it. He was also grinning maniacally, which left no doubt that he was a madman. After that, he took the animal's head in his own hand. Then he tossed the head into a bowl and began to sprinkle it with dry rice. He also added drops of blood from the knife into the pot with rice and the head and started mixing everything thoroughly. His eyes were wild, and the man was incredibly pleased with what he had done. He was preparing for a terrible crime, and it became clear that he was involved in a horrific curse ritual. When everything was ready, Song-sik began to laugh maniacally. After witnessing this, No Seok-dae couldn't regain his composure for a long time, but it seemed this was the section he wanted to look into. However, he was aware of the deceased's use of raw rice and chicken heads. But for whom and against whom was such a terrible curse made? Suddenly, the elder froze in place as a terrifying idea struck him. He thought that the mother could have used the man for her horrific ritual and then disposed of his body and all evidence. Suddenly, on her way home, the girl was approached by an unknown stranger. He was following her at night and wanted to walk her home despite her resistance and refusal. But the stranger insisted that it was dangerous to walk alone at such a late hour. The hand he placed on the girl's shoulder was quickly shrugged off, and she pushed him away with all her strength. But it seemed the unknown man only enjoyed this more, smiling at her despite scaring her badly. He also realized that his actions might look very bad and vulgar from the outside. Moreover, he felt very sad when the girl behaved that way, as he was trying to win her over. The girl quickly said goodbye to the boy and tried to leave him as fast as possible. Furthermore, this kind of situation had been repeating constantly, and she was already tired of pushing him away. But at the last moment, he grabbed her by the arm and started pulling her toward him, which was an unacceptable decision on his part. The boy insisted that he was ready to take care of her and her sick father. But Ja-eun wasn't listening. She just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the stranger heard a voice that sounded quite familiar to him. To his side, he saw the girl's father, who was running toward him and shouting at that very moment. He looked very angry and was holding a broom, which could easily smash the suitor's head. Seeing her father, Ja-eun began to scream and tried to stop him, as she knew better than anyone how this could end. The stranger, having no choice, didn't want to make the situation any more tense. So he quickly turned around and decided to leave, not wanting to create problems for either himself or the girl. Moreover, he knew that the girl's father was unstable and didn't want to cross his path any further. The girl, approaching her father, asked how he had managed to find her and what he was doing outside at such a late hour. As it turned out, he wanted to eat chocolate cookies, but he needed his daughter's permission for that, so he went looking for her. Hearing this, the girl hugged her father. She was touched by his gesture. So, she allowed him to eat no more than one chocolate cookie. Meanwhile, the main character returned to the spot where the pot with the curse had been found. Examining the place, he wondered how the girl could have learned about the setup and who could have left it there. He didn't like what was happening in the settlement, as the recent events were very strange and made him anxious. However, he had no options, and the only thing he could do was accept what was happening. Moreover, he began to suspect Song-sik, as besides him, he didn't understand who else could have done such a thing. But the constant thoughts exhausted him, and he decided to rest. Suddenly, he heard the voice of a woman who had woken up under the fence and was trying to peek inside. She knew the hero was home, so she didn't stop shouting until he came out onto the street. After a while, she started banging on the gate and could easily break it down. Moreover, she was angry at the boy for responding and ignoring her. Seeing the woman and realizing she wouldn't calm down, the boy tried to understand her reason for visiting and who she was. As it turned out, she was Song-sik's wife and was looking for her husband. Opening the gate, the hero informed her that he didn't know anything and couldn't help her. However, such a response didn't calm the woman. On the contrary, upon seeing his face, she became very frightened. The thing was, the hero couldn't stop laughing and continued to do so even in front of her. But realizing the absurdity of the situation, the boy tried to explain that he was laughing at the fact that the woman was shouting and standing in front of his house at such a late hour. He also recalled the situation with the girl and her trauma, accusing the woman of not believing her words and that no one besides him had defended her or even asked what had really happened. Listening to him, the woman grew angrier and angrier. But when her patience snapped, she grabbed the boy's clothes with both hands and held him tightly, not letting go. She was taken aback by his audacity and how he tried to play the victim, bringing up the girl's trauma. She couldn't believe that for him, the girl's trauma was far more important than her husband's disappearance. However, the woman's words had no effect on the main character, and he continued to laugh. He tried to push her hands away from him and kept mocking her husband. From his words, it was clear he thought the man was foolish and sick. After all, he had been wandering around the village lately, waving a knife and clearly wanting to kill someone. If he had reacted wrongly, Ja-eun could have become his victim, along with himself. So instead of being so proud and stubborn, he suggested the woman apologize for her husband and back off. It seemed his words had an effect, and the woman started to apologize. Tearfully, she said she was very sorry, but she still wanted to find her husband no matter what. The guy, exhaling heavily, replied that he last saw her husband on the day of their confrontation, and after he left the house, he was no longer on the street. But the woman kept pressing for more, increasingly irritating the main character. Besides, he tried not to give the impression that he knew everything and was involved in the disappearance. Meanwhile, the woman left Hyeomyong's house, and he sat in his bathroom, reflecting on the recent events that had unfolded. Looking in the mirror, he noticed something strange on his clothes. It became clear that there were bloodstains on his shirt, but he didn't know whose they were. Suddenly, he caught sight of a strange silhouette behind him. He realized someone was watching him, and that person was right outside the window. The guy quickly turned around to catch a glimpse of who it really was. However, he saw no one in his window. He thought the person might have hidden in the yard, not wanting to reveal themselves. But there was no one in the yard either. Besides, the suspect would have to be very tall to reach the window. So finding nothing, the guy decided he must have imagined it, probably due to exhaustion. Meanwhile, events shifted to Seong-sik's house, where his wife was sleeping. But she tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. She noticed blood on the guy's clothes, and the thought that it might be her husband's blood wouldn't let her rest. She was also very angry at the main character, which kept her on edge. The woman was deeply worried about her husband, especially since he hadn't returned home. Moreover, during their last encounter, they had fought, and he had been very drunk. Such thoughts could drive her mad, but there was nothing she could do about it. Meanwhile, the two brothers, having climbed a mountain, began scattering the ashes of the deceased elder over the settlement, as the village chief had instructed. They believed that after death, the man could find peace and enter a better world. When the task was completed, they decided to call the chief and inform him of everything. But the conversation with him was very tense, and a new responsibility weighed on the men. The chief was very concerned that the men were the only witnesses to the elder's death and had found his body. Therefore, no one in the settlement should suspect what had really happened. At the cost of their own lives, the men had to keep silent and tell no one about it. The next day, a new meeting was held in the settlement regarding Seong-sik's disappearance. There were many people present, and the girl realized that the main character had arrived first. But he replied that he was just curious about what had really happened to the missing person and how his mother, whom everyone was talking about, might be involved. However, it seemed his words sounded uncertain, and the girl regarded him with skepticism. After a while, No Seok-dae began his speech. He spoke about the missing man and how he had indeed been wandering around the settlement, trying to kill innocent people. Moreover, the elder had rejected the mother's mercy, attacking the girl, and then fled the settlement. But since he was a member of their community, the search for him hadn't stopped, and many people were involved. Suddenly, one of the brothers who had been searching for him the previous night began to speak. He assured everyone that they had scoured the entire area and still hadn't been able to find Seong-sik. Hearing this, the main character began to smile, as he was the only one who knew what had really happened. He was also constantly watching the dead man's wife. He suspected that soon her patience would wear thin, and she would unleash her anger on everyone, especially after the news that the old man hadn't been found. The woman nervously began to clench her fists, barely able to contain her rage. Unable to hold back any longer, tears in her eyes, she began to shout at everyone present, unable to believe that even after so much effort and searching, her husband could just vanish. Hearing this, Hyunsop lifted his gaze and looked directly into the poor woman's face. His brother did the same, looking at the woman with a puzzled expression. The chief also joined them, raising his eyes to the grieving woman, who continued to cry but could do nothing. Only the main character held himself together. He looked very tired and was the only one who had known everything from the very beginning. The woman, who kept falling to the ground and getting back up, said that he had last said goodbye to her before going somewhere. It was very strange, as she hadn't seen him at all since then and hadn't heard anything about him. Hyun-sup wanted to approach the poor woman and try to comfort her. However, the chief managed to grab him by the leg and stop him at the last moment. It seemed Hyun-sup realized his mistake, as this could cast doubt on the truth of his own words. So slowly he began to turn back to his place. The woman couldn't calm down and continued to cry. Suddenly she turned and looked at the main character, who was sitting in the crowd and staring right into her eyes. At the top of her lungs, she screamed that he was the murderer. At that moment, most people turned to look at Hae-myung. Everyone was staring at the guy who had been accused of a brutal crime. The chief also joined the crowd and began searching for Hae-myung with his gaze. The woman continued, saying she had seen blood on his clothes, so she was sure he was the criminal. Suddenly, Ja-eun looked at the main character in shock. She couldn't believe such an accusation. But the guy remained calm and didn't want to listen to the accusations directed at him. Besides, the woman had apologized to him just the night before, which he pointed out to the crowd. So he stood up and was about to leave, as he felt he had had enough. But the woman, again accusing him, tried to stop him, calling him a coward. Hae-myung saw no reason to stay there any longer, as he vehemently denied his guilt and wouldn't accept any accusations. The woman, who had also stood up, asked whose blood it really was on his clothes. But the guy didn't consider the blood on his clothes a serious accusation. Moreover, he accused the woman of lying, as that could also lead to serious punishment. At that moment, the woman calmed down a bit, realizing that the evidence of the hero's involvement wasn't really substantial. Suddenly, Ya-eun, who had been sitting quietly until then, began to fidget, and she couldn't help but draw attention to herself. She stood up and shouted to the whole room that it wasn't Song-sek's blood, but the old woman looked at her in surprise, as she hadn't expected the girl to defend the main character. Ja-eun began to explain that when the elder attacked her, Hae-myung had tried to protect her, and during the struggle, the elder had managed to injure him, so it could have been Hae-myung's blood. As proof, she pointed out the injury on the guy's chin. It seemed she was speaking convincingly, and this greatly helped the main character. Moreover, she put the woman in a very uncomfortable position, and the chief, who had been closely watching the developments, suddenly became very serious. The girl's words indeed seemed very logical to him, and he appeared convinced that the hero wasn't involved. Instead, he asked the woman what she thought about it. However, she couldn't respond. The chief understood the woman's feelings and tried to share her pain. He bowed to her and said he wouldn't allow anyone to treat new family members the way she had. Furthermore, he suspected the woman was possessed by evil spirits, as she wouldn't behave like that, and he intended to pray for her to her mother. Seoko and Hyun-sup were to continue the search for the missing man, as the chief had promised. With that, the meeting could be considered over, and No Seok-dae announced that everyone was free to go. So people began to disperse, leaving the room one by one. The girl who approached the main character said he owed her, but her behavior irritated the man, who had tried to get her attention the night before and had run into her father. Meanwhile, the chief and the two brothers remained in the room, and the man ordered them to search the main character's house. It seemed he suspected Hae-myung, and truly terrible events awaited ahead. Meanwhile, events shifted to the police station. A lot of time had passed since the last murder, and the case hadn't progressed, with the killer still at large. The policeman wanted to punish the two detectives for making the case public, but failing to find the murderer after all this time. And the guys, with no choice, had to endure it all. Despite only 10 days having passed, the investigator didn't believe the guys could uncover the real criminal. His trust had been shaken, and he considered their actions disgraceful. Moreover, they had no information besides a photo of the suspect from a surveillance camera. But the guys were convinced that the best way to stop the murders was to present their society, and that's what they wanted to do. However, the investigators and police faced immense pressure after turning the case into a public investigation and putting it on display. At that moment, it was the loudest case, so criticism from others was entirely expected. But the guys assured that their boss had agreed to this risky move and was not against trying to prevent future murders through publicizing the news. Still, the guys had to put in all their efforts to find the likely murderer, as the management was already waiting for the investigation to conclude. For this, all possible surveillance cameras near the crime scene were checked, but no one resembling the suspicious man in the photo could be found, and tracking him wasn't easy. Furthermore, the chief hoped to find the suspect through a backpack or a piece of clothing. But this step was anticipated, and people with similar clothing were checked and detained. The police had no choice but to restart their search from scratch and try to find more evidence. So ahead lay hard work and relentless searching. After a while, the guys discussed their future plan of action in their office. They were going to call in the girl who was the daughter of the deceased, but they quickly abandoned that idea as it seemed too much. Even with the boss's instructions, this idea felt abnormal and too traumatic for the child herself. Moreover, the men didn't know what questions could be asked of the child, as everything had ended before she arrived, and her parents were already dead. Suddenly, someone entered the guy's office. Kang turned his head to the guest. As it turned out, they had brought in the daughter of the victims. But it was so unexpected for the men that Kang, the lead detective, stood up from his chair. It was clear that this girl was genuinely nervous. She said she had only learned about the incident a few days ago. Therefore, she hoped she could help find the murderer who took her parents away. Delighted that the girl had expressed a desire to share everything, the detective wasted no time and began asking her questions. Gathering her strength, the tearful girl informed them that one of her father's cars was missing, and she believed the murderer might have escaped in it from the crime scene. This detail surprised the detective, as he hadn't thought the murdered man could have two cars, and this detail hadn't been considered during the investigation. Meanwhile, events shifted back to the settlement, where the main character was sorting his belongings at home. But he didn't even notice how a suspicious person was once again watching him. He took off the bracelet from his wrist and left it in the house. After that, he locked everything up and got ready to leave. Meanwhile, in the chief's temple, active planning for the search of the guy's house was underway. It became clear that the men had been watching him for several days and discovered that after his morning workout, he hadn't been doing much, making it impossible to search his house. It seemed this news didn't impress No Sukde much, so he pondered what could be done next. But there was another possibility. The thing was, the men needed to stray from the righteous path, but such behavior was considered particularly dangerous in their settlement. And the chief, who was about to light a cigarette, confirmed the men's words, saying it was indeed the worst thing they could do in their settlement. After all, people who acted this way could take their own lives, burn alive, or they could be possessed by spirits that could simply kill a person. The brothers were shocked by the elder's stories and asked if anyone had ever strayed from the path and where he had gotten such information. The man's mother had told him about it. Moreover, she had shown that someone had killed Song-sik, but they hadn't been able to see the face. And suddenly, Hyun-seop realized why they needed to search the guy's house and began to suspect him even more of the crime. However, the chief wasn't sure about the guy's involvement in the crime. He just hoped that none of his people had done it, which is why he ordered the search to start at his house, as the dead man's wife had yelled at him. Moreover, No Suk-dae hadn't done anything wrong and hadn't particularly strayed from the right path. After these words, Hyun-seop began to get very nervous. He hoped there was a way to stop this somehow. And as it turned out, such a possibility did exist. According to the chief, it was possible when a person was ready to kill someone themselves, as it all began with intent. So this managed to calm the men down a bit. Furthermore, the chief was convinced that Song-sik was already in paradise, and he didn't even doubt that the man had been murdered. The chief was firmly convinced of this. At the same time, he intended to give the men a box when they were about to leave. Opening it, the men saw an enormous amount of money inside, which was even impossible to count. The first thing that came to the men's minds was to visit an expensive restaurant and have a nice meal. The brothers pondered the idea of where to spend their own money. After taking another look at the stack of cash and assessing the amount, they reached an agreement. They decided to relax that evening. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to the city, far from their settlement. The main character was in a grocery store, planning to buy 2 boxes of snacks. But when he heard the price, he realized he had spent all his savings. At that moment, he began rummaging through his bag, trying to find his money to pay for the items. However, his actions caught the attention of the cashier, who couldn't take his eyes off him. He was so fixated on the boy that he didn't even notice when he found the money and handed it over. Meanwhile, the hero left the store. The cashier, noticing a stack of cash in his bag, called someone to report it. He also mentioned that he had never seen the boy before. It became clear that he had arranged to rob the main character, and it was about to happen soon. Meanwhile, the detectives returned to the police station to continue their investigation. They were too tired and downcast to jump right back into work, so they decided to grab a bite to eat first before resuming their search. Besides, there was a great restaurant nearby that served spicy pork, which the detectives loved. They also contemplated the girl's words in the 2 cars belonging to the victim, leading them to think that the man might have been involved in some business dealings. As a result, he might have had a conflict with someone, which could have led to the murder of his family. Hyun-seop and Soko weren't wasting any time either, and were already in the city. Suddenly, Soko asked the taxi driver to turn back and stop. However, his brother didn't understand why he was against his friend's decision, since they had just arrived. But when they glanced in the mirror, they saw the main character walking down the sidewalk toward them. Suddenly, he raised his hand, preparing to call the same taxi the men were already in. But the car didn't stop and continued on its way, just as the brothers had instructed from inside. They thought it was the perfect opportunity to search his house while he was away. The boy was left standing in the middle of the street, frustrated that he would have to walk quite a distance. With few options, he decided to stroll around the city. Suddenly, Detective Kang spotted the main character across the street. He began to closely watch him and his actions. Meanwhile, Hyo Myung had no idea what awaited him ahead. He walked calmly, contemplating his next moves without suspecting a thing. The lead detective started to feel noticeably anxious. What he was seeing raised a lot of questions, and he didn't like it at all. Meanwhile, the main character continued walking down the street. Suddenly, he reached a dark and empty alley and decided to turn in, hoping to cut through. Besides, it seemed like the perfect spot for what he had in mind and why he had come to the city. But he wasn't alone in that alley. A group of men had been tailing him the whole time. It was the same cashier from the store, along with his friends, who wanted to rob the boy and take all his money. As it turned out, the main character knew he was being followed and had intentionally chosen the dark alley to set up an ambush. Immediately, the men demanded his bag and all his personal belongings, including the cash. But even with their threats, they couldn't intimidate the boy, who remained incredibly calm and even smiled. He remarked that he had encountered a lot of rude people lately, which really annoyed him. Then he started stretching, causing laughter and a flurry of emotions among his opponents. But in reality, the boy was preparing for a fight, trying to distract the men before he struck. Suddenly, he delivered a blow to the neck of the closest thug. After that, he grabbed the man by the neck, not allowing him to break free or retreat to safety. An incredibly precise and powerful upward strike dealt a significant blow to his opponent, staggering him. Moreover, he tripped him to ensure he fell to the ground. At that moment, after a quick series of 2 strikes, the thug found himself on the ground, unable to act. He could only scream in pain and rage. He also ordered the other men to attack and let the main character escape with the loot. But Hyo Myung didn't let him finish and delivered another blow that knocked the man unconscious. He simply waited to see who would be next and felt no nerves at all. The thugs realized the boy was no ordinary kid and could easily handle all of them. So they pulled out a knife and began threatening him again, trying to take his bag of money, promising to let him go afterward. However, the main character continued to mock them, saying that the situation was getting tense with the knife, but he wasn't scared at all and wasn't going to listen to them. Suddenly, a rough male voice came from behind them on the street. As it turned out, it was a detective who had been following the gang, realizing something suspicious was going on. Now the threats were directed at him, and the thugs promised to deal with him if he didn't leave the crime scene. But the detective stated that his principles didn't allow him to stand by while such things happened. At that moment, the thugs realized that the boy who had found them might actually be with the police. Showing his badge, he confirmed the thugs' words. They were involved in a group attack with aggravating circumstances and had threatened the main character while trying to take his personal belongings and money. They were all arrested for attempting to commit a crime as a group. Suddenly, one of the thugs, scared, decided to try to escape and ran straight at the detective. But he met him with a hard blow and continued to remind him that anything the men said could be used against them in court. After taking down another thug, he talked about the lawyer the criminals could face during the trial. He also mentioned that he wouldn't have to use physical force if they had just listened and followed all the orders. The main character, who was just observing all the events, remained calm and didn't react to what was happening. He decided to leave the crime scene without waiting to see how it would all end. However, the police officer who had come to help him didn't understand this behavior. He tried to shout after him and stop him, but it didn't yield any results. Meanwhile, the scene shifted back to the settlement at the main character's house. Seoko and Hyunsop had already arrived at the settlement and were ready to start searching his house. But they were trying to come up with a plan and a way to get inside without making noise. The older brother wanted to boost Hyunsop over the fence and then climb over himself to open the door from the inside. Making sure no one was around, they began to climb. Within seconds, Hyunsop was inside and looking around. He tried to take in his surroundings and carefully inspect all the objects around him for anything suspicious. But finding nothing, he simply opened the gate for Soko. Both men were inside and ready to start searching the house, not wanting to waste any time. Moreover, the brothers didn't even notice that the house was completely empty and that a bracelet left by the boy was lying at the entrance. Meanwhile, the main character was returning to the settlement, having called a taxi for himself. Sitting in the back of the car, he thought about what had happened and what role that detective was supposed to play in his life. The detective's involvement and sudden appearance seemed very strange to the boy, making him anxious. Additionally, he had a very bad feeling that wouldn't let him rest. He had no idea that a search was already underway in his house, with two men trying to find any evidence that could prove his innocence in the horrific crime. But aside from some rags and odd items, they found nothing. Suddenly, Hyunsuk felt a hand on his neck. He was startled and froze in place, not thinking it could be his brother, who was supposed to be on watch to ensure the boy didn't return. He calmed down and asked the man to let him go, but he continued his search. However, Shoko was unhappy that his friend had made a complete mess in the house, which could give away their presence. So he ordered him to put everything back as it was and to clean up before the main character returned. Besides, it was already late, and they had very little time to get everything done. Therefore, Syoko went back outside to keep watch while his partner continued searching and started cleaning up the house. The door closed, and the man was left alone in the house. Rubbing his neck, he smiled.